I have many vices, but I think this is my biggest vice. Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. We are working again on the saw vise, and I'm going to be going into detail on how this is all coming together, the joinery working, and actually spending a good bit of time thinking through and talking through the methodology of how this is getting attached. Today we're going to be working with the stretchers and the joinery to the verticals, and then the joinery of the verticals to the jaws of the vise. So we're going to be cutting the joinery for that and showing you some of the specifics about that. If this is something that interests you, I do have plans available on my website. I'll leave a link to those down below. But I'm going to be going through this in detail in a series of videos along the way. So I hope you like this. Let me stop talking and get into the project. So now it's time to start assembling these together. Now this is all made with, well, half laps, well, half of half laps, so I guess they're only called quarter laps. And all of these pieces will just sit on top of another piece. So if I want to attach this here, I'm going to take a notch out of here and then dowel it in. And now that notch is in there just to give it a little bit of mechanical strength. The dowel and glue will be what hold this together. But the nice thing about this design is everything is under compression. So when the screws are clamped down, everything is being squeezed together. So there's really no fear of things coming apart or wiggling in the future because it's always under pressure. So it's a fairly easy, simple joinery. We're just going to have to be making notches out of the back of this. Now in the plans I have 1 inch thick material, and you're going to come in a 1/2 inch and notch out that. Now the actual depth of that notch really doesn't matter that much, and so in this case I'm actually going to be coming in a smaller amount because I don't need that notch to be full depth, and I'd rather actually leave a little bit more material on the stock so that it becomes a little bit more strengthened, supportive, something like that. Now I've put a label on all of these pieces telling me where they are. This one is the front right vertical, and the tape is also on the reference surface. So this is my reference face. So I want to measure everything off of that reference face. And normally I would then set this to half the distance, half the thickness of this, so about a 1/2 inch. Cut that in there and make my mark. But I want this front face to be a little bit thicker so that there's more meat holding the compression. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on there, and I'm going to say, that looks good right there. So I'm coming in somewhere around like 5/8 or so, and I'm going to make a mark there. So we have this mark right here, and as you can see, it's not anywhere near the middle of the board. It's off a good ways. So I'm going to be removing this material here. But now I need to know how far down to cut this. So the next thing I'm going to do is grab one of these top boards, and I'm going to put this on here. Now, I'm going to be putting a 45-degree chamfer all the way along this edge. And so to figure that out, I'm going to put the other top board on here, and I'm going to draw a simple line here. And I don't care what that is too much. Basically, when I put that large 45-degree angle all the way along this, it will come down this way as much as it comes this way. So if I put that mark at the thickness of the board, then I know that's 45 degrees from this line to this corner. And then I can put this piece on here, put it on that line, and then make a mark. And so now I have the distance in I need to cut, and I have the distance out I need to cut, and I have the distance down, so I can remove this piece. And to make this even easier for future reference, I'm just going to set up another marking gauge at that depth of cut so that I can mark out all these boards. So now I can come in with this one, and with this marking gauge, referencing off the face, I can mark the end, I can mark the other edge, and then with the second marking gauge I can come in and I can mark the depth of cut. So now I can remove this piece of material right here. Now I have to talk a moment about this particular cut. This is a cut that scares a lot of people. You're going to be making a very long, heavy cut all the way down this. It's going to be a 4-inch wide by about 3 inches deep cut. And that can be a little bit daunting of, oh no, how am I going to keep the saw straight, and how am I going to keep it from twisting and turning and moving? And if anything ever seems scary to you, that's because you're biting off too big a chunk. So break it down into smaller pieces. So even like this one saw cut that we think of as one particular step in the puzzle, I want to break that saw cut down into several smaller pieces to make it a little less daunting. So let's take a look at that. So we have this big cut that we need to make. We need to go down about 3 inches, and it's about 4 inches wide. And we want to make sure that the saw isn't going to turn. We want to follow our line. We want it to be nice and flat on the inside. We want to have a really clean piece here that we can work with. Number one, you might want to oil up your saw, either with some beeswax or paste wax. I normally use paste wax, but the beeswax is just right here. I like to get some right into the teeth. This just makes it go that much easier through the surface, especially when doing a larger cut that it can bind up in. Now, I could use my big frame saw and cut this as if I was resawing, but the frame saw is a little bit less accurate, and I'm not going to get quite as clean a surface on the inside. So for that, I'm going to be using a larger tenon saw. This has a rip cut, it's a deeper gullet so that it can go down a little farther. The first thing I want to do is keep in mind which side of the line I want to cut on. I want to cut off this little piece, so I want to stay on this side of that line. I like to start on the back side of the board personally, just so I can bend over. I'm just going to take a light cut here. And I'm going to be slowly dropping it and slowly bringing the heel back on the saw as I cut back along this line. I want to develop that line all the way across. Now, some people like to start on the side closest to them. Feel free to go do that. It's just not as comfortable for me, so I like to start on the far side. But feel free to give it a try. So I'm going to slowly lower this back until I get a kerf that goes all the way across the... There. Now I have a kerf that is tracking. This is my new line on top, and I'm going to take that down about 1/4 inch or so, just to let that line then become something that holds this saw in place. Now what I want to do is eyeball this line. I have to go down the side here. I'm not going to worry about this side over here. I'm not going to touch the far side. I'm just going to focus on my side. So basically what I want to do, step number 2 in making this cut, is I want to keep this at the same point, and I want to lower this all the way down until I get down to that depth of cut. And so basically be making that cut just like that. So I'm just going to be looking at my side of the line, and I'm going to follow my side of the line down. And if you find yourself jamming, here, see if I can do it like that. Most of the time it's because you're putting too much force into the saw. That means lessen up on the saw, lighten up on it. And if you lighten up on it, just let the saw do the cutting, it becomes far easier to control. You want a loose handle in the grip. You don't want this thing to be a death grip where you're forcing everything into it. You want it to be a nice loose grip so that the saw doesn't have a whole lot of connection. It's more or less a pivoting point to your hand. So now we're going to work down this cut, and I'm going to keep my eye on the line on my side. And if I find myself veering off the line, I'm going to stop, I'm going to back up to where I was straight, and I'm going to put pressure on the saw and kind of twist the saw so that the sides of the teeth will then work back into that line and bring it back to where I need to be. Rather than trying to stay at the bottom of that cut and twisting it into place. It's easier to back up and correct the cut as opposed to trying to bring it back onto line. So, continue on down. And as I'm going down, I'm getting lower and lower, and I'm bending at the knees. I'm keeping my body straight, keeping my arm in line with the saw. And I'm going to go down until I get to that depth cut. So now I've cut at 45 degrees from corner down to depth of cut here. Take the saw out. Step number 3 is turn around and do basically the same thing on the other side. So now you're not worrying about the line on the other side, you're just worrying about the line on your side. And we're going to do basically the same thing. Start this in. And follow down the cut on your side. There, now I've cut 45 degrees from corner to the bottom. The next step is flatten the saw out and cut straight down. Now at this point you have a kerf on both sides that will hold this saw plate in place. And this is one of the reasons why I don't make this cut first, because if that cut hasn't been made, this particular cutoff is stiffer. It's going to hold the blade better. So if you don't have this cut off first, this becomes easier to control and cut straight down. Just let the saw do the work. Don't put any force into it. I can tell that this is kind of pinching on the blade, so I'm going to put a little bit more wax on here. Oh, there's my paste wax. A little bit of wax makes a big difference. And I'm almost to this depth of cut, and I'm about 1/8 inch away from there. So I'm going to think about trying to focus the toe down just a little bit. I'm going to put the saw into the cut, and I'm almost to depth of the cut there, and I'm almost to depth of the cut there. There we go, depth of cut on both sides. So there's the long cheek cut, and I've got a really nice clean line running all the way down. Good and tight, and right where I want to be. Next thing we need to do is make this cut and pull this piece off. Okay, so we've cut in from the end, we have a nice big cheek cut. Now we need to cut in the shoulder. So I could come in with this and put in a knife wall, and that would make it a little bit easier. But I like testing my skills and not relying on a knife wall to hold it in place. So I'm actually going to just do it a freehand cut. I'm going to start on the far side with me, and I'm going to be using my finger as a guide. So my finger will be pushing it away as I'm holding this in place. And let my finger actually set that first cut. So I'm just going to nick in here. And just like I did with the top cut, I'm going to be slowly lowering my heel and coming all the way back across. Now I've got a nice kerf running all the way over to the other side, and so I'm going to then cut all the way down until that cheek pops off. There we go. Now we have a cheek. Now, if this needs any cleanup, I could come in with a router plane and reference the surface and clean that up. But the way you can test that is you grab another board and you put that on there, and then you see, is there any gap all the way around this when you clamp the two together? Do you have a nice clean line on all three sides? And if so, that's all you need. This joint is done and ready for glue up and pinning. So next, we'll move on to attaching the stretchers. So I'm going to do this exact same cut on all 4 of the verticals, and then we'll come back and show you the stretchers. Okay, so now we've cut the notches out of the vertical items. We need to now do the same thing with the stretcher. And this one we're actually going to put one on either end. And this stretcher is then what connects these verticals together. So it will overlap each of the verticals. This also is what holds this on the bench. And so this will stick out past the verticals, so when it slides down on the bench, that stretcher will then sit on the bench on both sides. So the only real important things that the stretcher needs to be is, number 1, it needs to be connected to the verticals at the same point up and down. And number 2, the distance between the verticals needs to be the same. So in other words, the measurement from this shoulder to this shoulder needs to be the same on both pieces. Other than that, it really doesn't matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the same marking I had on the marking knife for how deep to make that cut. I'm not going to make it halfway in, I'm just going to make it a little way in. I'm going to use that same marking. And then on the first one that I already did, I'm just going to be marking in the depth of one of these pieces. So I put that on there, made a mark, and cut it there, made the mark in the other one. And according to the plans, this should be 9 inches across. On this particular one, it came out to like 9 1/16. So it's pretty close to the plans. It really doesn't matter what exactly that is, as long as it is the exact same on the 2 stretchers. So now that I've made this one, I want to transfer those same marks to this one. So let's dive in and take a look at that. So the first thing I want to do is get the marking gauge, and again I have the tape on the outside, and that is my reference surface. So I'm going to run around both ends with this so I know how far in to make the cheek cut, and I'm going to go all the way around the 3 sides. I'm going to guess at how far down I need to go. So then for the first end, I actually set up a marking gauge to the mark on this board so that I can come in on this end and I can make a mark here. But then for the other side, I want to line up the shoulder that I did earlier with that mark from the marking gauge, line those up, and then I'm going to bring my knife over here and I'm going to transfer this mark over onto this side here. And with that in place, I now know that these two will end up being precisely the same length, or as close as hand tools get. So I can bring over the square, put the knife in that mark, put that on there, draw that line across, and then carry that onto the sides. And we now have this all marked up and ready to cut the 2 notches out of it. Now this cut is going to feel very much like the last cheek cut, except for it's a little bit deeper. This one actually goes in 4 inches, and that happens to be just about the depth of my tenon saw, which is kind of nice. So I'm just going to let this run down until I hit the back here, which is my depth. The only other issue is if I were to do this the same way, my first cut would be at this crazy extreme angle, and I'd be all the way down laying on the floor in order to make that. So I'm going to actually cut down about this far. Then I'm going to rotate the board around and cut down about this far, and then I'll rotate the board around, then I'll cut down there, and then I'll rotate it again and cut all the way down to depth. So we kind of go back and forth rather than just making it all in 2 sides. So just like before, I'm going to start it on the back here, bring my heel down, create that kerf, and then start lowering my heel and dropping this cut in like that. Keeping an eye on the line. If I need to move it, I do. And now I'm down around there. I'm going to actually stop, turn the board around, and then continue the cut down on this side of the board. Then turn around and keep doing that, back and forth, until I get down to the cut I'm looking for. So now I've cut down to depth on both sides. I need to cut all the way down to depth across the middle. And this is nice with that depth stop on the saw. I just keep cutting until I hit that. And there, I'm at depth. Then, just as before, I'm going to grab my crosscut saw, put it in here, start on the back of that line, and drop my heel all the way across. Just like that. Cheek and tenon. This one's probably going to need to get cleaned up a little bit. Let's see what it looks like. I'll test that by just putting a square across it. Yeah, I've got a bit of a belly here in the middle. So let me show you what I do to clean that up. So to clean this up, there's a whole bunch of different ways. I could use a shoulder plane, I could use a chisel and a regular plane. I could use a router plane like this, which is kind of nice. You just have to have a big enough space so you can reference off of this, and you want to be careful when going all the way out here on the edge. You don't want any downward pressure on this. So yeah, I just grab this with 2 fingers and I have all my weight back here on this knob, and I just kind of swing it on those 2 fingers to clean up that space in between. I'll do the same thing from the other side. And then I can come in and test it with a square and see if I'm straight across. Like here, I'm good and straight across, but then I move into here, I still got a bit of belly in the middle. The other way you can do it is just with a simple chisel, just to come in and pare out until you get down to your depth. With this hickory, it's a little bit more difficult, but it's doable. And unfortunately, I'm running against the grain here, so it's not going to be pretty. But this will be inside the joint, so it doesn't have to be pretty. And there. Now I got a nice flat cut all the way across there. This will sit nicely on the joint. So the next thing I need to do is do the exact same thing on the other side. Cut down on the cheek, cut down on the shoulder, clean it up, and I'll have a stretcher. I'll have 2 stretchers that match precisely, and we can get ready to go work on the joinery between the stretchers and the vertical. There you have it. My big takeaway from this project is if you are intimidated by any particular step, and so you've broken it all down into all the steps of the joinery and each individual joinery, and then you look at that long cut and you think, oh my word, there's no way I can do that. Break it down into steps further, and then take a single cut and break it down into the different steps needed to make the joinery happen. This isn't a very difficult thing to do. Most anyone can learn to do this very quickly as long as you take your time and think about it, and you'd be surprised what you can get done. So again, I do have plans for this on my website. If this is something that you'd like to build along, feel free to check that out. I'll leave a link to it down below, and I'll have also a list to the whole build series for this if you want to see everything involved. So that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this. I do want to say thank you to the patrons on Patreon. You guys are the reason why I can keep putting out videos like this. If you'd like to find out more about Patreon, you can do that down there, I think. Also, if you want to subscribe, you can see the logo right over here, or behind the scenes videos. I have a logo right there. And that's about it for today. Until next time, have a wonderful day.